So I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for waiting there in the waiting room. We're making sure we all knew what was going on for the next hour and a half. And I want to just name that we, wherever we are, whether you're on one of the prairie provinces or farther afield, or perhaps in a different country, or perhaps even on the space station, that we live in sacred territory. We live in sacred space, that God has created and given us the gift of this land, of the stars, of the universe. And we know that people for generations have stewarded and loved this beauty. We pray for reconciliation and for acknowledgement of all that we have inherited. My name is Shelley Manley-Tanis, and it's a real honor to be here with you this evening. It's been a while since I've hosted something on Zoom, and it's kind of nice to be back on television. I am in Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. I use the she, her pronouns, and I'm in ministry in the United Church here in Saskatoon and a spiritual director. And I had the honor of being invited to work with the team from St. Andrew's College for part of the planning team for the Year of Intention. And it's St. Andrew's College and the Saskatoon Theological Union, but especially celebrating 15 years of being affirming. It is 15 years, right? Of St. Andrew's being affirming. So tonight, I'll just give you a really brief overview of what we are planning, and I'll just check. One of our tech people is Sean. People do have access to the chat, right? Okay, so we won't have time, or we won't be doing a verbal kind of introduction, but if people would like to write in the chat where you are perhaps, or how you're connected, or what brought you, or what pronouns you use, or what treaty you are a partner in, that we would love to see those things if you would like. You probably saw the note that we will be recording the panel, and once the panelists have spoken, though, and we go into a time for question and discussion, question and answer, then we will be stopping the recording. So I mentioned the Year of Intention, the planning team, and we're all online here tonight. That includes Sean Sanford Beck and Trish McCarthy and Dr. Keiko and myself. Is that it? Did I miss someone? No, I think that's all. And so I was kind of a community partner, coming in to work with all these folks who are part of the staff or faculty in this Saskatoon Theological Union. I'm going to start us off with, I'm looking for a book, but I did it on my screen. So I think most of you know tonight something of the topic, or at least you know that the word liturgy is part of the topic. We all perhaps know, I think we all know the importance, the strength, and the effect of words, that words are powerful. Words and music help us create reality. Liturgy is the work of the people, And I wanted to start with this reading as our opening. And this is the Inclusive Bible's version of some verses of the first chapter of the Gospel of John. In the beginning, there was the Word. The Word was in God's presence, and the Word was God. The Word was present to God from the beginning. Through the Word, all things came into being, and apart from the Word, nothing came into being that has come into being. In the Word was life, and that life was humanity's light, a light that shines in the darkness, a light that the darkness has never overtaken. And the Word became flesh and stayed for a little while among us. We saw the Word's glory, the favor and position a parent gives an only child, filled with grace, filled with truth. And we ask for God's blessing on the words and truth that we will share and hear and reflect on this evening. So the first person to speak this evening will be, and I know these people, or at least I've met them all online now, but I am going to get their bios up so I don't make something up, because I'm good at that too. I have them here, and so first, I will tell you all three. We have Dr. Becca Whitla, who's a professor at in the St. Andrew's College, and also Reverend Dr. Kyle Schiefelbein-Guerrero, who's also a professor here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and then Reverend Theo. And Reverend Theo is joining us from Manitoba this evening, Treaty 1 territory. And we'll tell you a little bit more about each of them as we carry on through the evening. But Dr. Becca is going to begin, and she is the professor of practical ministry and the Dr. Lydia E. Grucci Chair in Pastoral Theology at St. Andrew's College, here, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. She teaches worship, liturgy, preaching, religious education, and practical theology. Her book, Liberation, Decoloniality and Liturgical Practices, Flipping the Songbird, best subtitle ever, was released in December 2020. From her white Euro-Canadian settler perspective, she examines ways to decolonize liturgical practices, especially community singing. She worked in Toronto for many years as a music director in both Anglican and United Churches, and she also co-directed Echo, a 70-voice women's choir, and worked in the trade union movement, developing leadership through choral singing. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here tonight, Becca.
Thank you, Shelley. It's a big privilege to be here. I'm going to screen share. I have a short PowerPoint, and just to help keep me focused tonight. So here we go. Let me just get it set up. So I'm going to kind of start wide and narrow in towards liturgy, though I'm thinking about liturgy or worship all the way through it. And I will focus on the United Church, but I'm going to draw from some other resources in the spirit of us here at the Saskatoon Theological Union as well. So I want to just start by thinking about language. That's not the only way that we can embody um, inclusion and be affirming in liturgy, of course, but it's one of the root ways that we do it. And I just want to point to a movement that began in the churches in the 80s that started with inclusive language from the feminist movement and moved towards expansive language and emancipatory language. So these three words are kind of key words. I think Kyle might talk a little bit more about it later, but inclusive or non-sexist languages advocates for talking about in neutral terms about God, for instance, and talking about humanity rather than mankind. Expansive language opens up our lexicon to include multiple ways of talking about God, drawing, for instance, from the Bible and talking about God as Sophia in the feminine wisdom, or God as a mother hen who broods over her chicks. And then emancipatory language focuses on language that's liberating. There's a really nice little article and I do have a handout that Keiko will put in the chat at the end that that has links to a bunch of resources. And it includes worship words, which is an earlier version of the chapter in Bill Curvin's book, Gathered for Worship, called Joyful is the Dark, Expansive and Emancipatory Language. So you might want to check that out. So our language of prayer, when we think about our languages of prayer, so our language in worship, emancipatory language is language about community, ourselves, each other, people we don't know, in creation, and language about God, as well as theological language more broadly. Language is in our worship, of course, but also in our writing, our teaching, our leadership, and our community life. So I want to kind of open the lens to think about the ways we use language in all those different contexts. And I also want to be an advocate for language as poetry. Sometimes when we try to look for language that is inclusive or emancipatory or expansive, it can get clunky. But I think there's amazing poetic ways. And actually, Shelley, the way the opening reading was a beautiful poetic rendition in inclusive language of that first chapter of John. So that's a good example of that. So I'm from Toronto and I didn't know what a bunny hug is, but this is just to put it in context and to think about language a little more broadly and say, yeah, we call them hoodies, and it really changes the feel of the word when you call it a bunny hug. Somebody said to me when I went to the Y 2 weeks after getting here, that's a nice bunny hug. And I was like, what are they talking about? So here I borrow from the Lutheran Church in Canada. And this link is in the handout that Keiko will share about different ways to think about language. So language about God, about the Trinity, about people, about creation, in worship and liturgy, in interfaith relationships, when we think about disabilities and abilities, gender, gender identity or expression, Indigenous peoples, sexual orientation. So all of these are kind of frames for thinking about language. And it's not just about language, right? It's about our identity, the way we see ourselves and understand ourselves in the world. So a shout out to Lutheran colleagues for this really great document that outlines different ways of thinking about all these things. Now I'm going to kind of hone in on the United Church here and set the affirming commitment in its historical context. First, looking at the United Church, I think we need to understand how the commitment to being an affirming community and hence affirming liturgy sits inside the United Church's commitments to justice. And in your handout, there's a couple of timelines. One is a timeline of gender and transgender justice in the United Church, and the other is a timeline of LGBTQAI2S plus moments in United Church history. So those two timelines are there, and they're much more detailed than what I'm going to share right now. But in 1984, there was an inclusive language policy. The church acknowledged sexism and confessed the church's complicity. In 1986, the United Church apologized for their part in colonization. Then in 1988, there was a response from the Indigenous Church to those apologies. Also in 1988, the United Church declared that all people, regardless of sexual orientation, are welcome as full members of the United Church, and all members are eligible to be considered for ordered ministry. So this was the moment when the United Church said, regardless of your sexual orientation, you are welcome to be ordained and ministers in the United Church. In reality, it took a little longer for that to be fully embodied, but this was a historic moment and one of great controversy across the country, not just in the United Church, but also in the wider community. Fast forwarding, and there's also timelines for justice. On United Church website, so do take a look at everything that they situate all of this inside their struggle for justice. So in 2012, the United Church articulated its vision for becoming an intercultural church. And then in 2020, an anti-racist church. And here I note the leadership of Michael Blair, the first Black General Secretary, and my colleague Adele Halliday, who's the first, I think her title has changed, but at first she was called the Anti-Racism and Equity Officer. But she's still occupying, dealing with that portfolio. So here at St. Andrews, which also has a strong commitment to justice in the prairie context, following in the heels of Dr. Lydia Grucci, after whom my chairship is named. She was the first woman to be ordained in the United Church in 1936. Was a commitment to a policy for inclusive language and inclusive practices at the church, at the college. We became an affirming ministry in 2009. And in 2020, fairly recently, we rethought our justice policy to be inclusive of other justice identities and concerns. Okay, so in the United Church, there's a sister organization that partners with the church that is a United Church organization called Affirm United. And Affirm United is the mechanism through which communities can declare themselves affirming. It's a proud partner is how it articulates itself. There's a process that communities go through to make themselves affirming to queer folk. It involves education, discernment, and a decision-making process following PI, which means public, being out and proud, intentional, and explicit. So you name queer, trans, and two-spirit people and the gifts they bring. I'm going to give a couple of liturgical examples very soon. So to become affirming, there are 3 required commitments. First, a vision statement. Next, a plan of action. And third, an equal marriage policy. The process is to make the decision in community, consulting everybody, to join the national movement, Affirm United. And these are all required in the process if you want to declare yourself an affirming ministry, and then to celebrate with the service. So we're going to look at celebration, the way in which affirming services are part of the process. Here is an example. So again, on my handout, you'll come to a link that's to Affirm United and worship resources. Affirm United commissioned Inspire, which is a sister organization from that comes out of the United Methodist Church in the USA, to write 2 liturgies. So this is from the Pi Day Service 1, and this is the call to worship. And I just want you to see here how explicit liturgically the naming of queer folk is. The articulation of love, the honoring of identities in transition near the bottom, authentic self-expression, as well as trans, intersex, or cis identities. So it's a really out loud and proud and explicit expression in worship of being affirming. The second example is from a communion uh, liturgy on the Pi Day service 2. So these you'll find these if you follow the links on the handout. It begins. Let's try it. Maybe Sean, can you reply to me in the Sursum Corda? The Holy One be with you.
And also with you.
Open your hearts to the one who is love.
We open our hearts to you, O God.
Let us give thanks to God who takes risks for love.
For the courage and the holy that lives in us, we give thanks.
So then what follows is an articulation of the struggles and marginal spaces where Jesus is found as bold and beloved one who lives among us in the lives of Black trans women whose experiences of violence are dismissed and ignored, etc. So there's a sort of lamentation and then a celebration that culminates in the institution narrative at communion. And the focus here in the communion prayer is on Jesus among the marginalized, struggle, radical love, justice, and community. So I'm just going to pause here and let you look at that paragraph and see how explicit it is. That's the third piece of pie, right? Public, intentional, and explicit. So moving along, I want to highlight, this is a resource that I was actually on the executive of the Hymn Society when we gave the go-ahead for this resource. It's called Songs for the Holy Other. And this is a free resource of 45 hymns that you can download from online. It's hymns by, for, or about the LGBTQAI2S plus community. I'm just going to read that bit at the top. In our society and in our churches, we continue to build walls marking out and in. We continue to mark boundaries of us and them, of normal and other. Songs of the Holy Other aims to provide congregations working to dismantle these walls with a toolbox of hymns by and for those who identify as members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, aromantic, two-spirit, and other sexual gender minority community and their allies. And here's some examples. There's two Canadians here, Carmen Llanos, who was a student at Emmanuel when I was there, and David Kai, who's a United Church minister and hymn writer. So this collection is available for you. I'm almost done and I got my 2-minute warning. So I want to celebrate Sylvia Dunstan. Reverend Sylvia Dunstan was a prison chaplain and United Church minister who died at the age of 39, 30 years ago. She had cancer, and I think it was pancreatic or liver cancer, I can't remember, and died quite quickly in 4 months. A hymn book was published, a full collection of her hymns was published this last summer, and by GIA. She wrote hymns like Christus Paradox, You, Lord, are both Lamb and Shepherd, All Who Hunger, lots of beloved hymns that have been translated into other languages and appear in as many as 40 hymnals in some cases. So and she was queer and at the forefront of the struggle. If it's okay, I'm just going to read a tiny little bit about her. Is that all right, Shelley? Am I okay? Okay. Dunstan came of age in the tumultuous and intoxicating years of the 1980s in Toronto, in which the parameters for human relationship and understanding the divine were rich and expanding. In this context, as the United Church of Canada minister and lover of liturgy, she forged her own unique path. That path was a blend of post-Vatican II liturgical renewal, feminist, liberationist, and queer theologies, appreciation for theological and liturgical orthodoxy, and a deep, even tenacious love for the traditions of the early church. This was the time when the UCC was beginning to wrestle with pressing issues of the day, including its colonial past, embracing an intercultural vision for its future, and the full inclusion of the queer community. So that's it for me for now. Keiko has already posted the handout in the chat, and in it you'll find lots of UCC stuff. And I did include that document from Lutheran friends in the Lutheran Church in Canada, as well as a link to some resources in the Diocese of Toronto from the Anglican Church, and the Songs of the Holy Other, as well as a couple of academic articles for any of you who want to super geek out on all of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Becca. Yeah, we have Zoom clapping happening here, and thanks. I had goosebumps more than once. I don't know if others had that same experience, but it's the trajectory of the history in a very short time, that was pretty amazing. And the story of Sylvia Dunstan, a really helpful, important reminder of those who have gone before us, and not necessarily that long ago. Thank you so much. What we were I think I said this earlier, but we are planning to and hoping to have some time for conversation or questions after, but we will do that sort of at the end after we've heard from each person. So we will move on, and thank you again, Becca. It's really appreciated. So the next panelist, I have a short bio here. I have only met Rev.Theo by Zoom once, fairly recently, but I knew a bit about him because of social media and print media. And you may remember a story in the Broadview magazine. I think it's over a year and a half or so ago. But thank you for being here with us tonight. Reverend Theo was ordained into the Anglican Church of Canada in May 2019 and is the first openly transgender priest in the Diocese of Rupertsland. It is thought that he is also one of the first in the ACC. He's currently serving the Interlake Regional Shared Ministry of the Manitoba Northwestern Ontario Synod in the ELCIC. Reverend Theo sees his calls to ministry as a means to inform and educate those who are interested in building their faith in Christ, while having a desire to repair the deteriorating relationships with other spiritualities, faith groups, and communities, and most specifically, the 2S LGBTQ+ community. His desire is to help build the Christian church as a safe space once again. He believes that community plays a big part in building up an atmosphere of cohesion, love, and assurance, and inviting people to share communion at Christ's table is the highest example of God's hospitality. So hopefully, Reverend Theo, we have offered you our some of us Saskatchewan hospitality. We know you're a prairie person too, so welcome here this evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here. I hope that the Zoom is going okay here. We're getting some pretty weird weather on our end, so I keep getting some choppy screens. So hopefully that's not going to interfere with the next few minutes here. Um, I will admit this is the first time I've been part of a panel like this, so if I do a lot of word whiskers, it's because I'm really nervous, especially to be sandwiched between two well-known professors here. So what I am here to talk to you about today is some sets of liturgies that came into play in the Anglican Church. Now, the overall impression of the Anglican Church is it's not very inclusive nor accepting. And so there's been a lot of um, discussion and arguments and more discussions and talks over the last couple of decades about how to become more inclusive and how that's going to look. Changing canon laws and liturgies is quite difficult to do in our polity. Um, but in the fall of 2020, Dr. Eileen Scully, who is the leader of the Faith, Worship, and Ministry Committee in the National Church, decided to put together a group of people, of transgender folks, non-binary folks, and a few allies that are willing to work with us to create a set of transgender-specific liturgy. Now, I'm not sure if those have been shared with you or not, but we certainly can. I can share the links in the chat in a little bit. Um, but we got together over Zoom from across the country and talked about kind of what liturgies were missing from the Anglican worship. We did talk a little bit about, the gendered terms in the Book of Alternative Services and things like that. But it was more important for us to bring in some liturgy that would be things like name affirming, or where we would have blessings for various surgeries that were happening, things like that. So we got down to some of those more important items in our life transitions that people of the transgender community were looking for. Um, so we met several times over Zoom and did a lot of rewriting and writing and rewriting of these liturgies and tried to get them out into the Anglican parishes for trials and things like that. But the difficulties we ran into were that because they're so specific, unless somebody was looking for these liturgies, we couldn't really use them or do them. So um, we kind of had to skip some of the approval steps and of trials and things like that. But they did go to General Synod last year, which is, most of you might know, is where our national church meets and talks about all sorts of different. Oh, good. Trish put them in the link. Good. Different things, but liturgies are one of them, and canons and things like that. And some of you might remember from 2019, there was they were trying to change the marriage canon in the Anglican Church, and it was defeated in the Order of Bishops. So it was a pretty emotional 12 years that they were trying to get those changed, and we thought we had it right at the end there, and then we didn't. So when we brought these liturgies to the floor at General Synod, it was assumed that it would get defeated in the same way, that there'd be lots of argument and lots of fighting about the fact that this is even there and even on the floor. But surprisingly, it passed right away. And so there was quite the relief, although some shock. I think almost a year later, we're almost still in shock that it passed that easily. However, there is a clause in the liturgy that says that it still has to be approved for use by the local bishop. So you can even though the national church says yes, you can use these liturgies, you still have to get it past your diocesan bishop. So, there's still that one last level that could block the use of it. But the fact that they exist, even though some of us probably haven't used them yet, we haven't totally had a chance to trial them. The fact that they exist shows that perhaps there is still hope for the Anglican Church, right? That we're moving in the right direction, that we're starting to get a little more open to to people that have always been there, even though there's a denial that this is a new thing and that transgender is a fad, those kind of things. We've always been here, and we just want to be a part of the church just like everybody else. So having these liturgies available um, is just that one closer step. I know when I first came out as transgender, I was very afraid to tell my priest. I was very afraid to tell the bishop because I was just starting to discern becoming a priest. And so I was actually afraid he would just stop everything right there and tell me I wasn't allowed to continue. Luckily, that wasn't the case. Like I was one of the lucky ones that has had support all the way along. If anybody's been against me being here, they haven't told me, so I'm okay with that. But others are not quite so lucky. And honestly, if these liturgies had already existed at that point, I would have known that there was support somewhere in the Anglican Church. Um, and people now have asked me if I would use some of these liturgies on myself. I'm not sure. When I came out, my priest and I designed a renaming ceremony similar to a baptism, a rebaptism type thing, but we made it up because there was nothing that already existed, and now we have something that people can pull up and do as a ceremony within the church service on a Sunday, that kind of thing. So I don't know if I'll go back and use them, but knowing that they exist now makes all the difference, right? It just feels good that those are there. So even though we have a long way to go still, um, it is one more step forward. So within there's two documents that exist. One is the liturgies themselves, and they include things like um, affirmation for gender identity. So that would be, similar to a renaming or honoring a new name that you've chosen for yourself. There are blessings for the various points of a gender transition. So, blessing for surgeries or blessing for um, whatever step in your life process that you're at. There's scripture readings that are provided, hymns that are provided. So it's a little mini, you know, uh, a book, about a 28-page book there that has different liturgies and hymns in there, and prayers and all those kinds of things. And then there's a second book which I don't know if Trish would have put in, but there is a pastoral education for transgender Christians, supporting transgender Christians, which essentially gives some background on where these liturgies came from, the discussion about pronouns and gender and pastoral care, and a whole list of books that you could read so that you can do some of your own education on the transgender community so that we're not always the ones having to answer the questions. Not that we mind doing so, but sometimes it's good to uh, do some of your own reading. So I don't have anything as fancy as Becca in showing you um, what's in there. I wish I could talk about this for 15 minutes, but I do better in the question and answer part. So um, if I'm going to leave it at that, I realize that that was nowhere near any length of time, but if there are people that have some questions, it'll give you some time to look at the document between now and the question and answer. But I just want to say that it was very exciting time to work over those 3 years with these people, because the reason why in my bio it says apparently or possibly the first openly transgender priest is because in the transgender community, a lot of times you don't know, and in the queer community, you don't know who's out there. Depends on if people are really open about it, if they don't want to be open about it because it's not safe to do so. There could be more out there that I just don't know because they've chosen to be stealth and not be open about it. So to work with a group of 15 people that were openly transgender, openly non-binary, and super excited to talk about what we can bring for ourselves to the church and to liturgy and to worship services, it was a pretty exciting time for us. And then to be able to meet after the successful vote at Synod was, I mean, I wish we could have done it in person. It would have been an awesome party. But we shared a drink over Zoom and celebrated. So it was really it was a really good time to get to meet and to connect and to be able to network with some people. So now I know that there are others like me out there, and hopefully people will start to know that we are here and we're not new to the church. And even though you know the Bible and such is being used as weapons against us, we're not going anywhere. So, and hopefully that will give others, courage to come forward or at least reach out to those of us who are open and find support and such like that. So having something as simple as putting some liturgies together and prayers together that are transgender specific, it could mean the difference between life and death for somebody who's looking for help within a faith community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Theo. Just wanted to say that I put in the chat a link to the pastoral educational resources for supporting transgender Christians in the Anglican Church of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you so much, Reverend Theo. Everyone brings their own unique gifts. We're not we don't have to compare. Becca's PowerPoint and your story. I mean, we're so thankful. I guess one thing for me is I was just reminded again, and we talked about this when you and I met on Zoom, but just a reminder of the differences in polity around liturgy. And as the Saskatoon Theological Union moves to work more and more together, and as ecumenism is, I think, probably the only way to go, it's a good reminder. I think sometimes in the United Church, we take for granted that we write and read and just say whatever we think we want, or we think we do. So, reminder about that, and the layers of checking, like who gets to decide what we say. And especially thank you for your courage for everything and for being here tonight. Thank you. We'll look forward to some more conversation, and I know there'll be some questions or comments for you. Okay. Thank you all again, and we're doing great as far as time. It means we'll have some time for conversation, and that means I can introduce our next panelist, who is the Reverend Dr. Kyle Schiefelbein-Guerrero. He said we can call him Dr. KSG. He is the Grace Professor of Leadership at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, Saskatoon. Previously, he served as the Steck Miller Assistant Professor of Worship and Liturgy at United Lutheran Seminary in Pennsylvania, and as Bridge Pastor at St. Timothy Lutheran Church in Philadelphia. So that maybe gives you a little sense of geographically where our next panelist comes from. And I love the term bridge pastor. I'm going to have to ask you about that sometime. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so you're not worried, I am physically in Saskatoon right now in my apartment. So I am here. It's enjoying the snow as much as possible. So I'm going to share some insights, Lutheran insights into resources. It was interesting what Shelley had said earlier, kind of, the United Church more freer, the Anglican Church more structure when it comes to the liturgical practices. Lutherans were kind of in between the two. We have authorized resources, and we have resources that we wish were authorized, and we have resources that we don't really care if they're authorized or not, as long as they align with our what we have committed to. And so I'll talk a little bit about both the authorized and the kind of parallel resources. But as a good Lutheran, the first person I need to start with is, of course, Luther, who I think gives us a foundation for this. In his letter on translating, which he writes in 1530, he's having to defend to people who don't think he should be translating the Bible the way he is. And so he writes, "We do not have to inquire of the literal Latin, how we are to speak German, as these asses do." If you've ever read Luther, you know he's very colorful. "Rather, we must inquire about this of the mother in the home, the children on the street, the common man in the marketplace. We must be guided by their language, the way they speak, and do our translating accordingly. That way they will understand it and recognize that we are speaking German to them." So Luther's commitment to the vernacular, which is a huge part for him of the Reformation, isn't just translating into German. It's translating it into the language people can understand, comprehend, and connect to God. In fact, he in another letter where he has to defend his translation of the Psalms, he goes in and says, yeah, I have to add words every once in a while so it makes sense because I'm translating the meaning. I'm not translating it literally. And for me, grounding this kind of importance in liturgical practice in Luther's own commitments about language is important. That we as Lutherans have always had a commitment to language. In the early 2000s, in preparation for the newest regular hymnal in the ELCIC and the ELCA, there was a series of booklets called Renewing Worship, and the second one was called Principles for Worship. And what Principles for Worship did was to provide guidance for how the new hymnal was going to be formed. And the first thing it starts out with in Principles is on language. And it says specifically that language is a gift of God that must be done in dialogue. So it says on the screen here, God gives language as a means through which human beings establish community with one another, interpret the world of God's creation, and preserve over time both their stories and God's story. And throughout the Principles for Worship booklet, which I will put a link to, you can download it still for free, the importance of God's story and our story always coming together is that dialogue that must happen. And so it's lifted up in our language. The language of worship reflects God's love for all creation. We seek to use words, images, metaphors that express the breadth of God's love. So again, our language is not just staid, static, even solely biblical, but it's language that can help us unpack who God is and how God reveals God's self today in creation. So the language of worship invites us to see the world from the perspective of God, to envision the world in a larger way and strive to discern God's purpose at work within it. Words, images, and metaphors are always being re-evaluated as the world changes and according to our discernment of God's purpose for the world. This means that our language, as Luther would say back in 1530 and 1535, must help us unpack God and the cosmos. Who we are and how we understand ourselves to be changes and evolves over time. Our language must reflect these new and renewed understandings of all of creation. Yet when ELW, the Cranberry Hymnal, came out in 2006, these grand commitments to expansive language seem to have been missing. Now, I had an opportunity to dig in the archives of the ELCA and found a lot of the response forms people filled in to evaluate the provisional resources. And there was a concern among what seemed like a loud group that the resources were getting a little too progressive, pushing us a little too far down that road. And so, out of nicety, I guess, the editors pulled back just a little bit from the expansive and emancipatory, as Dr. Whitla was talking about with language, those forms of language. I would note, I was just looking when Dr. Whitla was mentioning Sylvia Dunstan, there are 4 hymns by her in the ELW. I did check. Plus, we have a lot of other, that I know of, authors and composers who are queer, but their hymns don't necessarily reflect that identity. Things had to change, and I'm calling this the decade of development, which is a little bit over a decade. In 2005, of course, same-sex marriage is legalized here in Canada, the year before the hymnal comes out. In 2009, the ELCA, where I'm originally from, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, approves ordination of LGBT candidates. 2 years later, the Canadian Lutherans, the ELCIC, does the same thing. And in 2015, the Supreme Court in the United States ruled that marriage equality was to be enacted throughout the United States. Very different way of legalizing it than here in Canada, which is why it's sometimes tenuous depending on what's going on. And in 2016, the ELCA, of course, with input from people in the ELCIC, worship, the 2 church bodies often work together for worship, issues the supplemental resources for use within the ELW service of marriage. And that's where I'm going to turn to. The supplemental resources, which is available for free for download, and since I have now mentioned that twice, that I put up resources, there you go, there's the list of the resources. What it does is it takes the ELW marriage rite, and in the first part removes the gendered language, no longer the husband, wife, man, woman language. In fact, it includes, you can use spouses, you can use life partner. It centers marriage on baptism, relationship, and community, which one would think, yes, theologically, those are important in marriage, but the marriage rite that was in ELW, some of which was a carryover from the previous hymnal, was very, God made them male and female and bound them together, the very kind of Genesis type language, which was reinforcing gender norms. And also the rite notes that mutual love is God's intention. This idea of this mutual love, not hierarchical love, not opposite gender love, but mutual love, however that may be, is part of God's intention. In the marriage itself, the central part of the rite, like I said, it adds spouse or life partner as options for how you refer to the other person in the marriage. It brings in the kind of theological understanding and even further highlights it, that marriage is happening, that the 2 people together are causing the marriage to happen. Not that marriage is pronounced upon them, either by the state or by the church, but that they have joined themselves together in marriage. And as the text goes, let no one separate. I will say when my husband and I got married, I like the old language of asunder. So I changed it to let no one put asunder. It just sounds cooler. And in Lutheranism, we can make those changes. And then the longer prayer of blessing highlights God's call to love, expanding the image of God's love. The prayers themselves, and I like this. This is a particular intercession I put on the screen. The prayer specifically calls for every life-giving relationship and companionship, for the health of families and all kinds of human communities, and for those who teach us new patterns of abundant life, that in Christ a new creation may come to life and grow. And really, this is in its strongest terms in this rite, where there is a breakdown of those normative relationships that have come to us from history, but to say, no, all types of relationships, all types of communities, all types of partnerships are deserving of God's love and can help show forth Christ and the relationship Christ has with all of creation. Skip that. Dr. Whitla touched on this briefly. I'll go into a little bit more, but the ELCIC in 2018, in some sense, upped the ante on language a little bit when the Church Council approved the guidelines for inclusive language. And specific to what we're talking about tonight, it notes that one, that our theological language, the language used for God, is always metaphorical and symbolic in nature, which, as I said, we can trace all the way back to Luther. We can, of course, trace it back even earlier than that. And it commits that the liturgical language be inclusive for all people. This language is to proclaim justice and well-being. It's to reflect hospitality and welcome. So here's some quotes from that I lift out to commend to you. Our communities are filled with diverse populations who reflect the beauty of God's good creation. Thus, we actively work to recenter our communication in more inclusive ways. That is done by using gender-neutral terms and avoiding gendered roles and actions, as Dr. Whitla had said, about moving from inclusive to expansive to emancipatory language. But the language isn't just descriptive, describing who's there. Our language is active and it does something. It acts, the speech act, it acts to support a welcoming community where individuals can avoid unnecessary distinctions. This so that the language causes things to happen. It doesn't just describe, it enacts. And so again, decentering heteronormative standards that limit the diversity in society. In 2020, LTS became a Reconciling in Christ seminary through a similar process that Dr. Whitla described with the Affirm process that St. Andrews did, requiring a statement and such. In 2020, the same year, a new worship resource came out called All Creation Sings, the Purple Supplement. And this was more explicit about expanding language, including expanding scriptural images for God, drawing upon the plethora of metaphors, as well including prayers specifically for the public church, healing breaches of trust, lamentation about prejudice and racism, and more. Some hymns that talk about expanded welcome are also included. So here in Commonwealth is God's commandment. You see in this third stanza, gender, races, tribes, and nations, hear the Holy One who calls, bidding all to work together, bridging lives and breaching walls. Or build a longer table, which talks about, again, making our table of welcome bigger rather than putting up walls. So the parallel organization to the ELCIC is Reconciling Works, which originally started out around 40 years ago as Lutherans Concerned. And on their website, you can find a document called A Deepening and Expanding Worship, which includes confession and forgiveness texts hymns and readings, prayers of the day and of the people, Eucharistic prayers, sendings, and blessings. So just to give you, since I know I'm at my time, just to give you some texts here. So one of the options is a prayer of confession, which follows like the one in the hymnal. God of all mercy and consolation, come to the help of your people, and in particular your LGBTQIA plus children, whom for too long the church was a harmful place. Turn those of us who have actively participated in the sins of homophobia, transphobia, and fear to live for you alone. Or a prayer about naming, helping us to dissolve the binaries between clean, unclean, holy, unholy, human divides, saved, unsaved, and even death and life, so that we can move beyond all of those binaries, just like the binaries Jesus mentioned specifically in the Gospels. Or a benediction. God invites us into their future, recalling that in Genesis, God is in the plural. Where one who makes all things new has made their home among us, the church being reimagined. And there are additional resources on their website, Stations of the Cross, an Advent devotional, a name blessing liturgy, and a liturgy of welcome. And then there are still much to do for Lutherans. And here's what I have at least, the first one has been done pretty much, but the rest of them still really need to be fleshed out more and brought to the people in the ELCIC and the ELCA who help with the crafting of these liturgies, so they can be more well known. We have that exact same problem too. They're out there and people just don't know that they're there. So that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. KSG. I just love, yes, we have Zoom applause again, and giving thanks. I just love that we went from Martin Luther and his reference to the asses, to the cosmos, and all the way to dissolving binaries. What a journey. Thank you so much. All three of our panelists have given of their time, their energy, and of themselves this evening, and we do give thanks. Thanks for your interest in St. Andrew's College. If you'd like to learn more about any of our programs, please reach out to the college recruitment officer. The link is in the video notes below. And do feel free to like and share this video to spread the word. Peace and blessings be with you.